third meeting of the State Board of Education to order. First on the agenda is the teacher turnover research report from Mary Lee. You're first on the agenda. Thank you.
You want to make preliminary remarks?
Okay.
Well, I would start with two cautions. One is that it is very easy to confuse turnover rate at the school level with turnover rate at the system level. In the charter sector, this doesn't really matter because the charter sector is the collection of autonomous schools. But in DCPS, teachers leave the system at a little under 20% a year, but they leave their schools at about 25% a year. And this even confused the reporter I talked to who had read the report. But of course, when teachers leave their schools, some of them transfer within the system. And that's the difference between 20% and 25%. And I concentrated the report on the school level because we've been talking about the system level for a long time, but school level data have not been calculated. And from the student's point of view, it doesn't matter whether a teacher leaves to go to another school in the system or leaves to go elsewhere altogether. From the student's point of view, it's all the same. I suspect that from the principal's view, it's also the same. Principals try to build a team of teachers, and train them, and help them, relate and collaborate with each other, all that kind of thing. And so when people leave, it's disruptive. We expect a certain level of turnover. People retire. People have their reasons for leaving for another school. Maybe there's a new principal and they don't get along that well. It's just as well probably if they have a amicable divorce. But nonetheless, because the rate in DC, whether it's DCPS or charter schools, is higher than the national and higher than other cities, that's problematic. The second caution I want to give you is that this report is reliant on point-in-time data. It's built on employee lists for the DCPS schools that I get once a year as public information, either through the council or through the FOIA request. Well, there are people who start the year but leave early. There are people who go out, they have a baby, who knows what. But some schools in the middle of the year, which is when my list came from, will have vacancies. And it is not necessarily reflective of what it's like at some other point in the year. When you have a large school with a large faculty, it isn't going to make that much difference whether you're off by a couple of teachers. But when you have a small school and a vacancy, that'll change the percentage. So that particularly for the small schools, you want to remember that there's a margin of error there. I think that the differences wash out when you look at it at a system-wide level. But when you're looking at individual schools, particularly if you're worried about the school where your child is enrolled, or that you're just considering a school with which you have some relationship, you want to remember that there's a margin of error. I tried to summarize the findings in the executive summary. I'll run through them briefly in case some of you didn't have a chance to read the report. It's higher at the system level than it is in other cities. It's also higher at the school level than it is in other cities. I mean, the fact that it's lower and higher than the national is perhaps to be expected because it is higher at cities, but that it's higher than any of 13 cities, large urban districts that were studied in a rigorous research study recently suggests that we are, I think it is very interesting that the level of school level turnover is almost exactly the same, first of all, for charter schools and for DCPS schools. Charter schools pay less. I have the data on that. I didn't include it in the report because I didn't want to prejudge what the critical factors are, and that would have just given that real prominence. But anyway, charter schools do pay less. But they don't have a higher turnover rate than DCPS schools. Second, I separated all ET15s from classroom teachers. In DCPS, ET15s are those who are represented by the Washington Teachers Union, and they include people who don't have teacher in their title. They include counselors, social workers, librarians, therapists, and I would have thought that they left at a lower rate. These are people who have usually come up through the ranks and they get their certification in their specialty as a librarian or a counselor. I think that they would be more likely to stay put if they want. That was a surprise. The turnover rate when you look at wards is higher, it's highest actually, in the schools in wards 5 and 8, lowest in 1 and 3. I think this is not surprising because the rate of teacher turnover also rises with the percentage of at-risk students in a school, and we have schools with much higher percentages of at-risk students in wards 5, 7, and 8 than we do in wards 2 and 3. By level,
2 and 3 or 1?
what?
2 and 3 or 1?
Well, in this particular case, 1 and 3, but that's in the case of the wards and teacher turnover by ward. But in terms of at-risk percentages in schools, it's 5, 7, and 8 that are the highest, and 2 and 3 that are the lowest. Again, a bit of a surprise that elementary and high schools were pretty similar to each other, and middle schools were higher. Now, of course, those of us who had middle school age students would suggest that there would be some reasons for that, but I would have expected the high school rate to be higher than the elementary rate. It wasn't. In terms of principals, again, a surprise. The rate of turnover was about the same for charter schools and DCPS schools. But I expected that DC, when you have almost 25% of schools starting each year with a different principal, I would think that would be high. It's the national average. And that's despite the fact that the recent report by the DC Auditor's Office found that DC principals reported being more stressed out than principals in national studies. But we have the same rate as the nation in general. Being a principal is a high-stress job everywhere. And I think it's going to make it harder to deal with it. I think if we can get more studies done on teacher turnover, we as a city can identify the factors that affect it and try to deal with it. When schools all over the country are having this problem, we can't look elsewhere. We may be able to look at selected districts that hang on to their principals, but all the same, it means there's probably a supply problem. And I think that's the most important things that I found in the two sets of cautions that I wanted to give you about interpreting the results. I guess I should also mention, and I have a whole section at the back, that I did not go into why we have the turnover rates we do. I think that really deserves to be studied. I've studied this DC public schools for years, and my experience is that I can have impressions so that I can make a very well-educated guesses, and then if I go and do a study, I'm right half the time, I'm wrong half the time. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to recommend that somebody else do some studies. The ideal study would be if we could really look to individual teachers and talk to everyone who leaves confidentially, so that they really felt comfortable, that it wouldn't come back to haunt them. But exit interviews, I think, are not to be altogether trusted, because if I were a teacher leaving my job and it was because I didn't like my principal and I didn't like the way the school system was run, I would not get that put on the record, because potential employers don't want to hear that I am a malcontent. And I did recommend as a model a study that was done by the Chicago Consortium, because they didn't do that. They didn't have the resources to do that, but they looked at a whole bunch of factors and they did correlations. And, it's a very interesting study, and I think it's something that's doable. Particularly if we get a research research practice partnership here in the district, we would be able to call on people who know how to do that kind of study well. I also listed a whole bunch of factors that have been found in other school districts to affect teacher turnover, and those are just the things you can look at. Same thing with principal turnover. Okay, Jack?
If you want to keep talking, that's great, but I
talked long enough.
thought a dialogue
I'd rather
might be
do
helpful.
dialogue.
Great. You used the word correlation, and I just want to make sure that we all understand that correlation is not causation.
Exactly.
So those are different things, but then I appreciate you being clear on that
Yeah.
as you have this discussion with us and with others in the city. It's very important. You talked about the exit interview model, and you also discussed a recent teacher turnover report where 13 other cities were
Yes.
conducted. Was there an in-depth review of why folks left, or was it like this report where you really just look at the numbers of attrition?
I think there was some discussion of why they left. I can't remember exactly where they got their information, but it was the numbers that were important. And then they did do correlations, because of course there were breakdowns by the kinds of schools. And that's one thing that was very important in the Chicago study, was that they, separated schools by their differing characteristics.
Meaning socioeconomic, et
Yes.
cetera? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
I'm gonna start just with some numbers questions. So when you talk about that the high schools have an equivalent turnover rate to the elementaries, which is not
Close,
surprising.
yes.
So do you think that could be related to the fact that it is point in time and you don't pick up the internal year switch? And I was just on a panel with Marcus the other day, and I know you were commenting that really there was some amount of within the year. Do you think that, I mean, I
Oh,
guess you didn't
well.
look at it, but could that be, do you think there might be enough that would explain that? or-
That's hard to say, because it would all depend on when teachers left. My lists tended to come from January, February, maybe early March. so that I wouldn't pick up anybody who had come in and left in the months preceding. Now, that only affects those teachers who came into the school at the beginning of that year and left before mid-year. Obviously, if they'd been at the school the year before and they didn't show up on the list the following year, they were captured. I also, of course, didn't pick up any teachers who left after the time of my list. And there are teachers who leave in March, April, May, for whatever reason.
So, one of the factors that's very, kind of unique in this report, I think, compared to other places is, I think most cities do report on teacher turnover, and for whatever reason, the DC school system and the charters don't make a regular, well, ECPS doesn't make a regular report of school by school turnover. The charters do, but it's deep inside of the report, as I understand it. So you get this data via these FOIA requests or by asking council around budget hearings. Is there something that you could request that would allow you to determine the mid-year turnover?
I could file FOIAs 3 or 4 times a year. I haven't done that. Frankly, I'm a little reluctant to file FOIAs because, you know, how much work do I want to create
I agree.
for the school people?
Is there a request that the council could make to say they want to just know
Oh, if they wanted to know,
the council could make?
yes, they could make the request. Now, somebody would have to analyze it. And you see, that's somewhat time consuming. The school system knows from their personnel records just exactly how long each individual is there. But I've not seen them do any kind of report like that. They do report annually to the council on the number of classroom teachers who leave the system by their impact ratings, by ward. They do not report this at the school level, and in fact, there was a court case where somebody FOIA'd that information at the school level, and the school system said, we're afraid that would identify individual teachers, and we're not going to do it, and the judge agreed. So what we have is very limited, but apart from those reports, which are by impact rating and by ward, the school system does not put out reports. The only other data I've seen on that was done in connection with the National Academy of Sciences study. The work on that was done by Mathematica, and in the reports on that project, they provided that information for 6, 7, 8 years ago, but I haven't seen anything since. I should say on the charter schools that not only is the information buried in an annual report, but that this is self-reported data. There's a single question. It says, what is the attrition rate, or what was the attrition rate of teachers in your schools? And so we have to take their word that that was the attrition rate. Now, one thing happened, I was able to get those reports for 3 or 4 years from the Public Charter School Board, and I copied all that along with the number of teachers at the school into spreadsheets, because there's no way to do it electronically. And I noticed that there were several schools that were reporting 75% teacher attrition. I said, what is this? I seriously doubted that it was that high. So I took every school that had more than 50% reported attrition rate, and I took their rosters, because that's something they include. Each year they say, this is the roster. And I compared the names on the rosters from year to year. And in most of those cases, it turned out that somebody had confused attrition with retention.
Oh,
So all I could do was flip it. I did do that. I mean, if a school said it had 75% attrition, and I looked and I said, well, they kept a lot more than 25%. So somebody must have confused it, and so I flipped the percentage. But that was all I could really do, was flip the percentage. And it certainly raised a question in my mind as to how good the reports are. I think some schools are probably very scrupulous about it, but others are looking at this long list of things they have to report and saying, oh, I've got better things to do with my time, and doing something on the back of the envelope, which may or may not be right, but it's all we have. I did think it was interesting, that 25% is high rate of turnover, so most of them are being honest.
I wasn't able to get through all of it, but did you see a correlation year by year of teacher attrition that may have correlated with the principal's exit in that similar year?
I'm trying to put that together, because I've started another project, I'm just doing it. People have asked, well, okay, so now we know what the overall rate of turnover was from year to year, and we know what the overall rate is for DCPS for 3 years and 6 years, for charter schools 3. But maybe we've got just sort of a relatively small group of teachers coming and going, and then we've got others who stay around. So what I'm now calculating when I have time is how many individual teachers stayed for 3 years and how many stayed for 5 years. And I'm trying to match that with principals, because certainly, in my years, just when my kids were in school, but even later, when a new principal comes in, there's some teachers who wind up leaving. They just, they may be great teachers and they're just not getting along with the new principal. And that happens. And then, of course, a few of these schools have reconstitutions. That meant in 1 year they might get rid of 80% of their teachers. That's by design. You can say that's a bad thing or a good thing, but it's by design. It's not because the teachers are discontent. It's because the principal is discontent.
Yeah, I've done one. So, I guess you can't really tell this, but do you have any sense from the numbers how much of, we know that the turnover is the highest in the at-risk schools and lowest where there's the fewest number of at-risk students.
Right.
Can we say anything about whether or not part of what's going on is that teachers in at-risk schools are transferring to non-at-risk schools within the system? That makes sense.
I would love to track that, because this is only an impression, but it's the teachers I hear about. There's a gradual westward movement as teachers leave schools, particularly east of the river, but even east of North Capitol Street, and tend to move into other schools. They do not tend to go the other way, I think. And I've always remembered one comment in a Post article where a teacher wrote in and she said, I'm at a school west of the Rock Creek Park, and I'd really like to teach low-income kids, but I'm afraid that it would be professional suicide. And certainly I've heard people comment that the fact that you can be a highly effective teacher in a school with a lot of upper middle class kids doesn't mean you're going to be effective with a very different kind of enrollment. And that makes sense.
I've heard that from plenty of teachers who say.
Yeah, and so this is one of those things where I would say this is an educated guess, which upon research,
So
might or might not.
One follow-up and then maybe a recommendation to the board. Again, is that something that we you could request from the council when they do their,
No, because you would simply have to track people name by name. I actually do not track
I mean,
them
the council could ask DCPS
to do a report.
to do a report.
Yes, that's true, they
I
could.
mean, as part of the,
Yeah.
they ask for that kind of information
Yeah.
when they do their,
Yeah,
budget
they
oversight.
cause the system to generate reports, which
So-
is something you cannot do, of course, with a FOIA. But
Right, so, I mean, I would just say that it might be something that the state board
Could
could,
ask about,
could
yeah.
request or work with you to request, that if we could collect that data, that would put us in a position to know something really important about what's going on in the term.
yeah, I think that's right.
So I wanted to switch gears and just give you an opportunity to talk a little more about the principal side of things. I noticed, I'm here in the executive summary, and I just wanted to clarify, it's like page 8, you've got the principal turnover by board from 2013 through 2017-18. Is that an annual turnover? So
Yes.
in Ward 6, 20% annually average over that period of time?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's
'Cause
correct.
In looking at my 18 schools or 18
Yes.
principals, 19 schools, we've had all but 2 have had new leaders since that period of time. So I'm kind of wondering if you could talk about, is it principals are staying for 2 or 3, 5 years and turning, or do we have a lot of schools that are seeing principal school leaders for 2 years and turning? And whether we know whether we're recycling people, moving them from school to school, or whether we're bringing in and cultivating new talent.
The recycling from school to school certainly takes place. And I see this because I have actually tracked principals by school since sometime in the 90s. And so every year when I look at the directory and I plug in the principals, I can see that there are principals who have transferred. But it's not a lot. It's more a case of they're leaving the system. Now on the other part, I'm just looking on page 37, I've got a table, this is in DCPS, that of 113 schools that were open over 5 years. 1/3 of them had 1 principal. 48% had 2 principals. 18% had 3 principals. So what we see is that for most schools, they keep their principals 2 to 3 years. And that is not as long as the research literature says. And, you know, this is research that's been done numerous times, so this is not reliant on just a couple of studies. And then, of course, I don't even remember, I was a little surprised by some of the principal turnover. And I did the rankings. And for the most part, it matched up by ward, but not nearly the way it did for teachers.
So I
And a
think,
few years ago, you know, I looked at the numbers by ward for a lesser period of time. Ward 3 wasn't doing much better than anybody else. So, one thing we've got here is a smaller sample size.
well, again, I'm interested in this, especially the principal side, because I think the continuity has an impact, and we reference the research says. So could you just expand on that a little bit? What does the research say? A principal should be there X number of years. and
5 years.
What impact does that have on students, on achievement, on some of these other things?
All of that. The research says 5 years. The research finds a correlation between high principal turnover and low achievement. And not surprisingly, higher principal turnover at schools with a lot of low-income kids. I have to say that there's some difficulty in these comparisons with elsewhere, because the only figures I could use were at risk. The free lunch figures are no longer meaningful because any school with more than 40% at-risk students serves free lunch to everyone. Well, this is not the case elsewhere. The studies elsewhere go by free and reduced price lunch. And so we've got a bit of a,
Is that
disjunction.
piece of data that we could recommend that the city collects? Because
Sure.
that still exists.
Sure, sure. And
Looking at those types of things,
Yeah.
if that's something that we'll have to
yeah,
research, that's what
and
we
the
need.
research talks a pretty fair amount about why in these other districts that have been studied, you know, why it makes a difference on achievement. And of course, you know, if you think about the schools with which you're familiar, and the ones you went to, the ones your children went to, it's disruptive when you get a new principal. And maybe the new principal is wonderful, but it's still disruptive.
So just a note, I think that, the Ward 3 numbers may average similarly, but I think we've had very, very good turnover in the past, 2 or 3 years. I think
That's right.
last year there was one change, and the year before that there was one change, so.
In the years before that, though, that's why I was surprised and I looked, but, you know, I have some familiarity with those schools from my neighbors, and I live in Ward 2, actually, but our neighborhood's in a Ward 3 school, and there was a fair amount of principal turnover. Unfortunately, it seems to have slowed down. In the entire DCPS system, it has slowed down a little in the last few years, particularly in the last 2 years. Now, I would add that in a study that was done by the Progressive Policy Institute, Kaya Henderson was quoted as saying, look, I'm not apologetic about principal turnover because, you know, we give principals 2 years to turn the school around, and if they can't do it within that period of time, then we want to get somebody else. And so this was policy. I think the policy may have changed, and that may account for the slowdown. I would also say, by the way, that the one-year contracts for principals, that goes way back into the 90s, and that the rate of 25% of schools opening with a new principal, that goes way back too. And I can remember that after the policy was put in place, superintendents would actually boast about how many principals they had replaced. And I think, I'm hoping that that has slowed down a little, because I don't see any evidence that it has improved achievement.
Great.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yes.
If anybody here wants to comment on their own personal experience, either in school or your children, you know, what is the effect of losing a lot of teachers? You know, what's the impact on you? What's the impact on you know, when your principals change?
Well, my name is Tatiana Robinson. I'm one of the 2 student representatives on the board, and I attend Ballou High School.
Right.
I'm a 12th grader, and we were in the spotlight last year with teacher turnovers and principals and a lot of other things. But it's kind of like from it's kind of my job with a lot of the committees I serve, when to hear from students on how things affect them. And when we get a lot of teacher turnovers, a lot of the students kind of lose their trust in teachers, because the school, Ballou used to be a safe zone where every student in the school had at least one person they can go and talk to, and like they felt safe. And now it's like it's changing, and we got to get back to the old habits, because we going through a lot of administration changes. We have a new principal, we have a lot of new teachers, and it's just like you start over every time you get a new teacher with starting over your trust again and learning how each student functions. So.
My name is Marjorie. I go to Capital City. I'm the other student representative. And what I can say with having like a teacher principal in our school, whatever, it exactly like impacts how like the students learn. They're moving like teaching classes, just like Tatiana was saying, trying to it definitely tends to impact a lot of students' grades, like just like how they learn inside of school and outside of school. So that's definitely one of like the harsh impacts that does happen in the school system. For example, last year one of my English teachers, she moved, so now like now there's like a new 11th grade teacher, and with that a lot of students just start complaining. They just start like having like a negative attitude towards like the new teacher because of just like the different like teaching habits that like the students aren't adjustable to. So that definitely causes a lot of like impact as well within the school community. So that's an impact that I believe happened with like a new teacher or new principal as well.
Also, with being a student, it take when she was talking about teachers leaving like after February or something, and they're not accounted for. It takes time to find a new teacher. So in between the teacher coming, it's always complicated when you try to implement grades from having a substitute in the classroom, because it's always complicated to find work for the students that's actually on that class's level, and then finding a substitute who's willing to actually teach the class. Like it's hard to find long-term substitutes that actually get up and teach the class, because a lot of substitutes should just give you the work and say, here's the work for the day.
Ashley, you on the line? Do you have any questions? Ashley? Laura, you on the line?
I am on the line, but I don't have any questions. Thank you, Karen, for asking.
You're welcome. Yes, I'm
I'm saying hi.
Oh, you can't see.
It's okay. I know she feel me in spirit.
Yes.
We're done. I have an organizational question. So are we gonna have Mary present at the October public meeting?
That was not the intention?
Well, I would highly recommend that, and I would recommend using it as an opportunity to invite some students and some teachers and some principals to come and discuss this. Both to give us some ideas for what could be in a subsequent report, to give us some ideas of other data that maybe we should request from the district, perhaps via the council.
We'll take a look, yeah.
I did think about recommending that you might want to hold a forum. And,
Yeah.
Anybody could come and just react and say whatever they have to say, and you could even have a panel discussion with people, principals and teachers particularly, on, well, okay, from their perspective are the causes. In other words, the people who are there on the ground and know other people, it might be worth doing.
So Mary, if we did do something like that, our student representatives have been very good at making sure that we keep our questions and our dialogue very student focused.
Yeah, sure.
And if we would do something like that, we'd want probably some help either from you or others framing the discussion
Sure.
so that it really focuses on what teacher turnover means in terms of outcome for students.
Yeah.
And really make sure that we're focusing on
Yeah.
the benefits and detriments of different types of turnover
Right.
for students.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's super important, but I do think it is also important to get people's understanding of what's driving it. I mean, that's when Marcus and I did the piece for City Paper, part of what we did was interview a lot of teachers, and it was interesting. I mean, the extent to which it's sort of centralized problems, or the extent to which it was school level problems, and what they were, and the difficulties it caused the teachers themselves to develop the further knowledge. So I agree, but I think we should maybe consciously focus on both.
It would also be nice to find out, what is it that keeps teachers?
Yeah, yeah.
We have
Yeah,
teachers
yeah.
who stay a long time.
Yeah.
What keeps them?
Mary, I have one question. In your report, did you draw any correlation between success for the academic schools, the education schools versus the other schools? I know they have strong principals and less turnover, with the exception of Kellis.
Yeah. Try.
Very, very low.
I know that I did separate what are called the application schools or the citywide schools. But citywide schools include the ones for the juvenile justice system, as well as the application schools that select theirs. And I'm trying to remember what I did with regard to the application schools in particular. Okay, I did do the, I mean, one could pluck them out from the long tables that list every school, but I'm not sure whether I did it solely for the application schools. I mean, my impression, looking at them school by school, was that they did have lower rates. You know, particularly Banneker and School Without Walls. Of course, they are teaching a rewarding, really rewarding group of students. And the research on what's most important to teachers finds that this feeling of teacher efficacy is perhaps the #1 factor for them. And when you're teaching students, you know, who have chosen the school and who have been selected on the basis of their record of achievement and activities, that surely has to boost the feeling of efficacy for many teachers. It's harder when you have kids who have attendance problems, that kind of thing.
In addition, some of my concerns is with, I'm sorry if I this one.
Sure.
But while I do that, what's interesting is your, in your report, you spoke about why teachers leave.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing to me that was striking that says this is a major problem. So for me, unless you can enlighten me, maybe I'm misreading, what would be important to me is what attracts a student to our system. I mean, a teacher to our system, first of all. And just what you said a moment ago, what would I think
Yeah.
those are two very important
Yes, yes,
elements when it comes to longevity.
yeah,
What
yeah.
will attract them, and what will keep them.
Right. And what I said comes from national research, not research here. And it wasn't, of course, part of the request for proposals. And if it had been, I would have said, no, I don't have the data and the material to do a good job on that. I do think that, you know, the national research has, and national research has been done for many years. You know, what do teachers want generally? And that can always be put together. But I think it would be nice to know what in the District of Columbia keeps teachers.
Thank you, Mary.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, so thank you.
I may be excused.
You can stay if you like.
I'm going to.
I want to thank Mayor for doing it, but I also want to thank the state board for,
Yes.
I think it was a unanimous view of everybody on the state board that this was a huge issue that deserved attention, and it hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the city. We don't collect the data, so we can't really have the discussions about it. So I just think it's great that people did this, and I hope it will really lead both to us looking at it, but also the other agencies to look at it as well, look at why it's happening, and look at how to try to resolve it.
Good.
Thank you. All right, next on the agenda is our ESSA implementation. We have, you all know these people?
Maybe.
All right.
Sure. So thank you for having us. We are here to give our update on our ESSA state plan implementation. Remember that this was a commitment that we made to the state board. In the state plan, we said that we would do periodic ESSA implementation updates. So I want to refresh you on those commitments. We'll give you an update on the current state of the system. So running the STAR framework and report card implementation. A lot of the report card implementation will be
Replacement.
rather redundant for some of you that are on the ESSA task force, but we want to make sure that we have like a level playing or level knowledge base for everybody so you know what's going on with report card. Also, we'll talk about some of the future commitments that we've made to you and some of the work that we're doing to pick back up on access to opportunities, climate surveys, and high school growth. So we said that we would provide updates to the public and the SBOE on progress in amending the accountability system 3 times a year. We said that we would co-host a roundtable with the state board before December 2018, and we said that we would bring substantive changes to the state board for approval. We also made a set of commitments around future state of the accountability system, one pertaining to piloting a measure for access to opportunities, also working on climate surveys and building out optional programs for LEAs to do climate surveys for possible future use in our accountability system. And then also we said by the end of this school year that we would bring you a proposal regarding incorporating high school growth measures into our accountability system. As you know, high school growth is a metric in our high school framework for this round of the accountability system. And I'm going to kick off to Donna, who leads our accountability work at OSSE.
Thank you, Justin. Good evening, everyone. So I want to just recap a little bit around the engagement involved in creating the ESSA plan as well as the engagement in developing the report card. So as you can take a look, this really captures the public and community engagement that has taken place through now. We are in the phase that you see circled in yellow, which is our implementation, our use, and the adoption of its use. And we've really been in this phase since August and then moving forward. So as you take a look, we have talked about the engagement, recognizing that we've informed both the content, the look, the feel, and the language being used on the school report card by over 4,000 responses that came from members of our parents and community, and also making sure that that was well represented throughout the entire district. So we had over 50 in-person sessions in all wards, and making sure that we actually took the feedback, analyzed it, put it back out in a report, transparent form, and then captured what changes were made as a result of that. Talked a little bit around the entire feedback session, but really looking at this most recent session, which was the design and language, and looking at over 2,000 parents, families, educators involved in helping shape the design and the language of the report card, and a breakdown here on your slide showcasing how that engagement took place, both in person, online, as well as in-person canvassing and streetwide canvassing. So a couple of things about the design and the language engagement that we work together with the parents and the community on. So one of the things we asked about was the layout and the organization of things in the report card. And for the most part, what we heard is that the layout was, for the most part, what people expected. And that there did seem to be a strong organization in the way in which things were put together that was easy for them to follow and navigate. Terminologies, definitions, and word choices, those are things that we wanted to make sure that the report card language was easily understood, but also recognize that there are times in which we need to use terminology that might not be something that someone is used to understanding, so it was our responsibility then to educate and to inform and provide access to understanding what that terminology meant. So we looked for places that we could have clearer, less jargony phrases and make sure that it still conveyed the most accurate information on the report card. And we tested different types of language, whether this made more sense or this made more sense, and then analyzed all of that in the phase 2 report that you received and are incorporating that into the final design of our report card currently. So a couple of the changes that took place. If you think back many months ago, you saw what were called wireframe designs of report cards. And in that wireframe, there was a header, and at that point in time, it was black and white, and it had the star rating in the corner of the header on every page. One of the things that we recognize is really important is that the report card is more than just the STAR framework and just the STAR rating, and that is a component of the report card. But the understanding was is that it may be confusing to people if it's on the top of every page, because every page does not necessarily factor into the STAR rating. So based on the feedback that we heard from the community feedback and parent feedback, that was removed from the header. You will see that there is a specific STAR page, so you can explore the ratings, you can explore the data, and all of the different domains and metrics, as well as student group scores and performance. And you'll also see that STAR rating on the profile page, but for the explanation of it, you'll be able to look into that on its own page, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. They also felt that there was too much white space and that they needed a bit more explanatory text. So we worked with design and made sure that we were able to embed additional explanatory text to cut down on wasted white space. That also involved adding more text boxes, so pop-ups. So you see like a little eye you can click on and you can get additional information, as well as having some of the text embedded. One of the other things we talked about was the reorganization of the school profile page. So based on feedback from parents and community members, we reorganized the school profile page to address the information that we heard from parents were most important to them. So we made sure that we had the information about the principal's name added into the profile page, and made sure that the demographic information was prominently displayed, as well as making sure that there was enough space for schools to write an individual message from the school that would be right there on the front of that page. We also heard a need for comparison data on the state average and looking at trends over multiple years. So those elements were factored into the report card. One of the aspects of the report card in terms of its use and the way in which it functions is when users are exploring the report card, they have the ability to select 3 different schools and be able to look at certain components of those 3 schools side by side. It's what we call the compare feature, which is the design of the tool. But one of the things that we wanted to find out from our survey respondents was what were the most important things that they wanted to look at side by side. And we took those responses and incorporated that into the programming, so that those elements that were most important to parents and community members are what appear in the compare feature side by side. So you'll see that the programs that are offered at a school, the grades that are served, information about teacher and staffing, and that would be common information. So that's looking at teacher experience, which is a common piece of data that we have for all schools. School safety and discipline, looking at an element of suspensions, and then whether before and after school care are available at that school. So those were all incorporated into that usability feature of the report card. So we talked a little bit about being in this report card engagement phase and really looking at what that means in terms of schedule. So looking between September and November, we're really re-engaging people and making sure that they're aware of what the report card is going to look like, getting them familiar again with the components of the report card. And for those who may not have been involved before, making sure they're aware of it and they understand it. And then in December, when the launch occurs, we'll be continuing with more communication, working on the marketing and advertising, and making sure that parents understand how to use the tool, how to access the tool, and assist them in that work. And then beyond, we'll continue to do more training and then do some surveying and look for feedback to improve our tool for the second year. A little bit about our outreach strategy that we have planned from now up through launch and beyond. We are looking at engaging with all of the elements that you see on the slide now, community leaders, our educational partners, service providers, as well as making sure that parents and families are involved in each and every one of those loops as possible. We have, I think it's over 4,000 members that have signed up for our DC report card mailing list at this point. So that's through all of the engagement that we've done and gathered email addresses. We're now able to push out information to all of those individuals that have been engaged at some point. We'll be using social media and our website, as well as engaging with parent advisory groups, and different school-based associations. So now a little sneak peek into our school report card and what will be coming up for launch in December. One of the things that a lot of people think about is the fact that we are referring to this as our school report card, and that is very true. Our report cards will be developed for schools, but according to the Every Student Succeeds Act, we are also required to create an LEA report card as well as a SEA level report card. So we wanted to remind people of that it's not just the schools, but it's also the LEAs and DC as a whole that will be generating a report card. So you'll see a sneak peek of some of the information that are still in design mode there for those level of report cards. And for more information, we have a OSSE website available, which is osse.dc.gov/DC school report card. So digging into the school report card, you should have a one-page document that's also available on our website, and it's called the DC School Report Card at a Glance. That is our first resource material about the school report card that we have put out and made publicly available to talk about both what the report card looks like, some of the usability features of it. So I want to go over that just a little bit and talking about the first page. When you are going through and using the report card, you go to a specific school, you're going to land on that school's what we call the profile page. And on that profile page, you'll see information about how to go through and tab through different tabs. You'll also be able to see the star rating. You'll be able to navigate to the star page. You'll be able to go into the academic performance page and look deeper there, as well as the school environment. You'll be able to select a school to use in that compare feature. As you can see, the parent organization information and the message from the school is prominently displayed, as is the information about the student population. Further down on that profile page, there's a list of school offerings. So these are school program information that schools have the ability to check or not check that were available for school. There's also extracurricular activities. In looking at, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list of all of the extracurricular activities that a school offers, but the school had the opportunity to actually list the elements or the items that they wanted to highlight about extracurricular activities at their school. We also have information about logistics, such as the hours of the school, whether before or after school care is there, and school transportation. Overall, we have over 150 data elements that are included in the report card as a whole. And then we're also developing some frequently asked questions. So as we start sharing that, we'll have information that will direct people on some of those frequently asked questions. But one of the most important things to remember is that the elements that are featured here on this report card are ones that were frequently asked by parents and communities. So this report card really answers the request that we heard from parents and families about making this information available to them in one place. We talked about the report card not just being a piece of paper about a school, but really being a dynamic website that users can explore and use. So not only can they navigate in to a school report card by typing in the name of the school, they'll also be able to navigate in using a map. And that will allow them to explore the programs available at schools, to be able to look at schools that serve certain grades, and they'll be able to explore all of our public schools in one single place. So that really begs the question of, well, how do we expect people to be able to use this report card? It's a brand new tool. It's the first time that our parents and families in DC have the opportunity to have this apples to apples comparison. So we are really hoping that this engages people more into the conversations about what's going on with our schools. How can they be engaged? This is an opportunity for them to have the same data that may have been available in 5 or 6 different places, all together in one place. We also hope that not only does it inform parents and our community members, but it also informs policymakers. So it gives them a source, a single source to start with, recognizing it's not an exhaustive source, but it certainly is a first stop of being able to look at the information. And then ultimately we're looking at the propelling school improvement. So recognizing that this is creating an apples to apples common language comparison and we'll be able to celebrate our successes and direct additional supports to our schools that need it the most. Obviously, with a tool that's brand new, a feature and opportunity for people to explore our schools, it's going to need some training, some information and resources. So we've been developing resources and tools that will help with people understanding how to use this, as well as how to utilize the information that's in it, not just how to use the tool, but how to actually utilize the information to engage in those conversations. So you have the two at-a-glances. We also have a technical guide for our STAR framework and the report card that talks about the methodologies used in the collection of metrics, where the data sources are that the data comes from. That's available on the website that I mentioned earlier as well. We have additional resources which are being developed. I already talked about the frequently asked questions. We will have a user guide. We also will have some, what we call a deeper look. So the at-a-glance is exactly what it says. It is just looking at the tool at a quick one-page glance. So we're developing some deeper reviews. So we'll have a brochure that's going to be a 4-page review. It goes a little deeper. Not as deep as what you would get in a technical guide, but that's why the technical guide is there, to really have those differentiated resources that are available depending upon what level of interest you have in exploring this tool. We also have video tutorials which will be developed, and then with all of the community engagement and outreach, we'll be putting that calendar on our website for people to engage and be a part of learning more about this tool. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the School Transparency and Reporting Framework, typically called the STAR framework. So as you are all familiar, the STAR implementation, creation of the STAR framework and the components that were in it were written and developed through the ESSA plan. So you were all involved in the creation of the high-level components of what went into that accountability system. And then once we had that approved, the next step was to really create the details. What was the methodology? What were the data rules that were employed? And how did we review and make sure that it was sound and valid rationale in terms of making these metrics? So between February and July of 2018, we had nearly a dozen meetings with LEAs to develop those details and finalize the methodologies. And those meetings resulted in the final business rules that were developed and published through the STAR Technical Guide. So the second one-page paper that we passed around is called the STAR Framework at a Glance. And this serves the same purpose as the report card at a glance. For those that are not familiar with the STAR framework, this gives you a first look at it, understanding what some of the components are. So it gives you an opportunity to look at what's in the STAR framework, looking at how the different points in the framework are spread out. So for example, in looking at the fact that we have 5 different domains. Those domains were defined within our ESSA plan. Academic achievement, academic growth, English language proficiency, graduation rate, and school environment. But within those domains are multiple metrics, and those metrics depend upon which grades a school is serving. So for example, graduation rate, AP, IB, would only be found in the high school framework. But if we're looking at a school that has pre-K, we would actually have some metrics that pertain to pre-K. The second page of that at a glance talks about how the STAR framework works. So one of the things we wanted to make sure that was clearly understood with our framework is the fact that we were looking at school performance of all students. So we're looking at school performance in a citywide context and helping engage our parents and school leaders in those discussions around areas of improvement, but also looking at the performance of our student groups, such as students with disabilities, at-risk students, English learners, and our race and ethnicity groups, and looking to see how are those groups of students performing compared to others in the same group. So this is a very deliberate approach to helping close that achievement gap and making sure that we are not only measuring and reporting it, but we're actually putting a significant weight on the performance of closing that gap. And then you'll see that the culminating score on the STAR framework is a result of combining those student group scores. So the all students, the students with disabilities, at risk, English learners, race and ethnicity, and then taking that STAR score and translating it into a STAR rating. From 0 to 100 points results in a 1 to 5 star rating. In working through this, we talked about the engagement that we have with LEAs. We've also had some additional engagement with principals, heads of schools, data managers, and other school personnel to make sure that they understand the framework and that they've been involved and engaged in the development of the business rules and the methodologies throughout the entire process. It's also one of the reasons that we are developing specific and targeted resource materials for our educators, because recognizing that they are oftentimes the first stop for parents, and that our educators need to understand the tool, and they also need to see how this tool can help drive their action in their work. Okay, sorry. As with any major data collection, one of the important parts is thinking about how we not only collect the data, but how do we validate the data. And in this particular project, we've taken on an additional role of what we've called metric calculation confirmation. So one of the things that we have been making sure that we are confirming is that all of the data that is collected is not only collected in the same fashion that we normally collect, but we're also taking a third opportunity for LEAs to see the data again and confirm it. So we've collected it, they've validated it, and now we're looking for an opportunity for them to confirm those points of data. And
Is that been a problem?
confirming the data, it's actually, this is the first time we've had a report card like this, so we wanted to build in an additional layer of doing these data checks to make sure that we were going above and beyond what had ever been done before to make this as accurate as possible. So just a little overview, we just finished our first phase of metric calculation confirmation, and what that means is we took every single element and student group calculation all the way down to the student level of data, and we provided that back to our LEAs, and we asked them to confirm this data. This data is all data that had already been validated, but we wanted to show it back to them again because it's not been used in this way before. We want to make sure that everything that's going out on these report cards, they've had the opportunity to look at and confirm multiple times. So we broke those information up into 2 different cycles. The first cycle was September 10th through September 28th, and our second cycle is coming up October 15th through November 1st. And once we finalize all of that, we'll be able to then begin putting together the data that actually goes into the report card and getting things ready for launch in December.
Have the schools seen their rating, or they've just seen the actual data?
No, they can't see the ratings yet because we have not calculated them. So that's part of getting that information back. They've seen the actual metric in terms of, so if it's a park score, then that's actually in the second phase. And so they'll be seeing what their park rate was, but not an overall STAR score.
Sorry to interrupt if you want.
That's fine.
Yeah, but I just, when will the schools actually see for the first time what their score, what their ratings will be?
That would be in a similar process that we do for other data embargo type process, so shortly before launch.
So not much earlier than this.
Correct.
Will we have the opportunity to see it before the launch?
I don't know the answer to that question, sorry. Wanted to review some of the information that's in the STAR framework in terms of the elementary school framework. So the elementary school with pre-K just goes over the different information. So this is elementary school without pre-K, and you'll see the elements that are in the academic achievement, academic progress, school environment, and English language proficiency components. Elementary school with pre-K, the only addition there are the elements around school environment, where we add in the 2 pre-K elements, so the class element and pre-kindergarten in-seat attendance. Middle school looks exactly the same as the elementary without pre-K, the exact same metrics. And then in high school, you'll see that that's where we have a lot of variety. So in high school, we've added in SAT metrics in the academic achievement section. We have a graduation rate section, which was not previously in any of the other sections. And then school environment, you'll see that in addition to the same elements we saw around chronic absenteeism, re-enrollment, we have extended years graduation and AP and IB, both participation and performance. And we talked a little bit already around the total score being the combination of our student group performance. So a little look to the future, and you heard Justin talk about some of the commitments that were made in thinking about what we had committed to. So just to recap, one of the commitments we had was to create a measure called access to opportunities. And as I just went through some of those other slides, you saw that there was a hold there for the access to opportunities metric. So one of the things that we have promised to do is to create a measure that will promote well-rounded education, really look at equitable access and engagement that students have to a well-rounded education. In developing that metric, some of the things that we had to consider, obviously the ESSA requirements. Anytime you're adding a metric to your statewide accountability system, it has to meet with the ESSA requirements. But then we also have to think about what types of burden are we placing on our SEA, LEA, and the individual school administrators in terms of collecting data. How do we collect this data and set up any business rules around this new metric? And then how are we able to verify and audit for quality or actual use and availability of certain coursework? And then making sure that we are not infringing upon the autonomy of schools and LEAs by creating this metric. So that's one of the reasons why you'll see the draft that we have of an access to opportunities metric is really thinking about what is the purpose of creating this metric. And we've talked about that the real purpose is addressing equity for our students, equity to both access and being engaged in a well-rounded education. And so we've listed a couple areas that we would be interested in working with LEAs during this pilot year to explore on collecting data to look at a well-rounded education. And I won't read through all of those elements that are there, but those are things that when we start having this conversation with LEAs very soon about creating this pilot metric, these are some of the areas that we are going to be looking at. Doesn't mean that it's all of the areas that we'll look at. We may hear some great ideas that come from LEAs or from other members of the community that could definitely enhance some of these areas. But we do have to make sure that we've considered, does it meet our ESSA requirements? And that particularly is around being able to disaggregate at the student group level. There are a lot of different types of things that people have suggested in the past that could be collected, but might not be able to be disaggregated to the student group level. So as we talked a little bit about our next steps, we'll be working with communities, LEAs, and also taking some work at research, best practices. There are a number of other states across the country as well who are interested in exploring the development of a similar type metric. So we'll be working with them. And then review all of the methodologies, develop what this tool could look like, do some initial data analysis and review, and then once we've done that through the pilot year, be able to determine the next path forward for implementation and bring that back to you at that point.
All right. School climate. So again, we made a commitment for an optional program for LEAs in schools that could be used in the future, possible use in the future in our accountability program. So a few things that we've done here is we've inventoried, there's a lot of different climate achievements being used around the district. And then also we have a statutory obligation with the council around a particular survey that I will highlight and also tell you our report is in play. So the Youth Suicide and School Climate Survey Amendment Act, it requires that OSSE implement a pilot program for collecting school climate data beginning in 16-17. So this statute is a little old. The Act also requires us to provide an annual report on the school climate pilot program, which our 17-18 report was due to the council on 21st. So as soon as that gets posted on LIMS, I will send you the link and you can take a look at that. The point of this report, just as a flag though, is not necessarily the data. It's more towards the implementation of the school, of this particular climate survey. But by school year 2021, the city law requires OSSE to provide a recommendation about how we would build out a school climate survey to all public schools in grades 6 through 12. So we are working towards that particular time. And then too, I wanted to share with this, I know people on the ESSA task force have seen this particular, they come to the ESSA task force meeting and have seen this, like we have other school climate surveys that are being used. One around restorative practices, in our restorative justice initiative, so culture of excellence and ethics assessment. I've included the hyperlink so you can go. And I think that's new this year. Yes. Excuse me. And this is a partnership with the U.S. Department of Education, NIJ, Comprehensive School Safety Initiative. So that's the one that we use for the statutory obligation with the council. There are also surveys with the DC Staffing Data Collaborative. There's also Panorama Student Survey with DCPS, and then also various charter schools use their own instruments. So there's a lot of variation in this particular space.
And the last thing that we wanted to refresh was a commitment that we made in our ESSA plan around developing a proposal for creating high school growth. So we intend to work on developing that and bring that proposal by the end of the 18-19 school year. Currently, we're reviewing and analyzing information that we've been provided for the first time this year that's connected to consortium level SGPs, and then reviewing that to determine the psychometric appropriateness of being able to utilize that with our existing assessment that occurred from 8th grade through high school, and then looking at what the different methodologies could be that would make the most sense and would fit best into our accountability system, as well as be the most accurate representation of growth.
This was the first year for our SGP.
This is the first that we have received them, so we have just received that information and we're beginning to look at reviewing and analyzing what that data means for our city.
Questions?
Questions?
I have a question going back to sort of how this was all being presented, and I just want to raise what I think is a concern, is that under academic progress, you've got both the median growth percentile and the growth of proficiency, and every researcher I've talked to regards growth of proficiency as a form of proficiency, not a form of growth. In other words, the idea was to show, is this a school that's on the move, even if most of the kids maybe arrive at low scores? And growth of proficiency doesn't show that.
I would respectfully disagree, specifically because of the methodology in our growth to proficiency metric. It is not the methodology that's utilized in places that use AGP, which does have a high correlation with proficiency. If you look at our technical guide and look at the methodology that we've created for growth to proficiency, it does not highly correlate with that. In fact, it also has a very low correlation with socioeconomic groups, which is not something that you see with proficiency at all. So I'm actually very proud of the way in which we use data and methodology to create what I think is a very worthwhile additional growth metric in our system.
How can we see that? I mean, that sounds very interesting.
It's in our technical guide.
Is that on, and that's online?
It is. Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you for listening to the board and to our constituents. A lot of these changes, though they seem minor, are really big changes, and they're changes that this board really pushed for. So I want to not lose that in this conversation, that this superintendent and this agency worked with us, and we really appreciate that. So thank you. I also want to just talk a little bit, and maybe Justin, you can talk to this, speak to this, since I think this was your part of the presentation. I'm very interested in the student climate survey piece, and there are some different moving parts here, right? Because the ESSA plan has a pilot, the council did their own thing at the same time, so you're being pulled in OSSE's being pulled in a few different directions. What's your sort of vision here, long term, and what's the real timeline on getting a student school climate report into our ESSA plan.
One, I think it's finding really good tools, because I think the purpose here is we want to make sure that you are getting feedback from who you are interviewing, and making sure that it is a survey where you can go and take direct action in your school. I think that one of the things, like if we were going to report out on all these different factors, but it doesn't translate back into some sort of action that a teacher or principal can do to build a positive from it. So we want to be making sure that we're like tied to like actual actions that you can do. So let's say if you have, like if you see that students don't feel safe and supported, and there are questions to that, a principal can go, well, more detail why. Like, is it because of actual security, or is it because maybe you don't feel safe and supported because of interactions with some sort of like guard of the campus or something like that. So really making sure that there's good information for people to go and take action. And this is an evolving space too. And I think it's just us trying to tease out and figure out what's out there and what is going to help move the needle to change some of the things that keep going.
I'd also, excuse me, there are sometimes multiple definitions of what we mean by climate and what other people mean by climate. So it could be satisfaction, it could be like safety, security, health, it could be other versions of sort of like culture in the room, and so it is partly like continuing to sort of peck away at which of those things we think are the most important and which of the things we think are actionable, and then narrowing it down between all those ones you saw on the slide to what is a good tool. And we're finding it's like the first. Could you just go back to that slide? The first one is a new one. That one, I believe, is actually the one from the U.S. Department of Education. And so we're excited to pilot that this
That's
year.
a free one.
It's a free
And
one.
customizable for
I don't
You're not
know.
thinking about
No. So like, yes, it is free. I don't know. I personally just don't. I'm not an expert in the customizable, but people have been interested in taking it. We're doing that this year. And we've had a bunch of schools interested in it. We're starting with this pilot with the participants in the restorative practices initiative, because these are schools that are already sort of like normed on wanting to do more about culture. But even the things we found in our report on the NIJ National School Climate, for example, like there's a lot of, I really hate this word, but learnings. It's a lot of things we've learned about like how hard and sometimes technically challenging has been to do something you think is really easy, and then the schools are like, well, but the system crashed, and like it doesn't send it to the right people, and like all the actual technical things you have to do, like some of them didn't work, we did workarounds, and like, okay, really good we didn't do that one without trying it first. And also right, no, I mean, this is like, it sounds like a sort of a bureaucratic thing to pilot it, but that's really why, because sometimes it just doesn't work. And also, for example, you can see some of the data we get, and it's not very differentiated in many cases. And so you don't want something, we're going to get back everybody's at a 2.5, 2.5 out of 5. Like, if we can't get the tool, and that might take a couple more years to try, or it might just mean that it's not the right tool for us, we should try another thing. So I think our vision would be to find a tool that does give differentiated, clear, actionable information, and then make it more widely available. To try and get schools to adopt it, because it's not something that's easily mandated. But then if we have something to pitch that we all feel good about, we can get better funding.
A couple of quick ones in terms of, and I might just be behind the ball on this a little bit, but in terms of the tools integration with My School DC, I figured that I guess ideally there would be some sort of natural transition between the lottery platform and the rating, so that parents could go back and forth as they're choosing schools come the new year. Have you thought about how to integrate that with the My School DC platform?
So My School DC will have, in the past, they've had information about park scores listed for schools. So this year, once this goes live, they'll be able to integrate the stars ratings, as well as a link that takes you back to the report card site. so that you'd be able to explore more about that school in terms of information that may be on the report card, different than what is on a school lottery profile. And then on our report card site, if you're interested in how to enroll in a school or how to engage in the lottery, we'll have a link there that will direct people where to get that information as well.
Got you. And my second question is, it seems like, at least for now, PCSB is going to continue with the PMF. None of the information on the PMF will be put into the report card, is my assumption.
So the PMF will actually, is actually released earlier than our report card is. But one of the things that they've committed to is putting the star rating on their PMF reports. And what you will notice as you start looking at some of the elements that are there is there are some integrations of common elements and then common methodology over time, recognizing that this is the first year for implementation, so we'll look forward to more integration and more consistent measures on the PMF, but recognizing also that this tool, the STAR framework and the school report cards, will be available for every public school.
Okay. And so it seems like PCSB seems to want to continue the PMF for the foreseeable future. Is that the indication you give?
I think we're in conversations with them about what a future could look like, but we haven't made any formal commitments either way. We're really committed to continuing the conversation with them about the value of common information, but also making sure it's appropriate and could work on both sides, which Chris was sensitive.
I think it's important to note that through the development of both the report card as well as the STAR framework, DCPS as well as PCSB and representatives from all LEAs have been directly involved in working with this. So this is not something that's been developed without them. They have been strong partners in this work.
And I guess my last follow-up to that was, I guess aside from I think the obvious, which would just be kind of the qualms about the early stages of implementation, were there any other reasons that representatives from the PCSB indicated they wanted to continue with the PMF? Any explicit reasons?
I think one of the things that, it's important for us to recognize is that a transition of any sort like this involves multiple layers, and when you think about the role and the reason for the use of those PMF elements and the metrics in there, they play a different role than they play through state accountability. And so I think it's going to take time to integrate and work those together. Charters have written goals around certain metrics that are in the PMF, and with charter authorizing, that takes time to revise those as well as move forward. And then I think it's important that they look in terms of that high stakes decision making that's going on. They take a look at and look at the data and look at an implementation time that makes sense for the role that tool plays for them.
I just want to say thank you for all your hard work. I know that this has been a difficult road for us all, and really appreciate your listening and collaboration between us.
Thanks, Karen. We appreciate all of your feedback and hope some of it reflected, but looking forward to working with you in the next couple of months as we get this thing really going and talking more about plans for rollout and ways to talk about successes in schools and your communities too. As we get a little closer to the date, we're still working on some of those ideas and logistics, but we'd love to come back and talk about how to highlight some of the successes via the STAR rating or other pieces of data that are in your boards. So thanks for having us.
You can also access those too. Maybe we didn't make that 100% clear. You do know you can find those and download and print those off yourself.
On the website.
On the website, they're at OSSE.dc.gov/DC School Report Card.
Just one note on the outreach. I've got an op-ed that will be coming out later this month in the Southwesterner on the report card, highlighting it for parents as we enter the lottery season. I'm happy that it will help do other publications. I assume the other board members do as well. If we can get support in crafting and ensuring we know deadlines and timeframes and when things will be coming out, so we can alert and work with the publications and awards around those deadlines and their publication deadlines.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. We'll definitely stay connected.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. One other suggestion. I know both of our civic associations and citizen associations are, in many cases, stronger than our agencies. So you get some who
to ask you for your suggestions.
Yeah, I always like to see, and also put
Just on that issue, I have been the president of the Federation of Civic Associations. I love you too.
Plug right in there. Kind of inside
Yeah.
connection.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Committee reports.
Administration and budget?
Administration and budget.
That's me.
Sorry, guys. We're recording, so you need to
Set with the performers.
recorder going, so I'll sit back. Thank you.
I don't think we have a lot to report on other than the new fiscal year started 2 days ago.
Sorry, Jack, to interrupt you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I was waiting for Ted to come back. Is it off the already leave?
Yes. Not all of the data.
I'm going to be able to answer a question.
We can ask Donna too.
No, I was just wanted to say, I think that what they presented and what they shared was awesome. That's all I wanted to make sure to share. That was fantastic, and thank you so much for coming back, showing us the follow-up on the things that we agreed to, investing in that trust, and also just being so incredibly thorough and thoughtful about your approach. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura.
The new fiscal year started. We've approved Faith Gibson Hubbard to be temporary acting ombudsman, and we are starting the ombudsman search. And we lost staff member that went live yesterday. Said to replace Devore. Not that she's replaceable. She was amazing. So we are down an administrative person, support person, and down the ombudsman. So John Paul's taking on some extra work, Faith's taking on extra work, and I believe Matt is stepping up on the administrative side, which we greatly appreciate. Thank you, Matt. Anything I missed?
Nope.
Thank you. Next.
The next is is Laura's committee. Laura, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, thank you. And Marcus as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had asked for an update from OSSE on movement related to high school graduation requirements. They have not responded. And in the meantime, there was a statement issued by BCPS that sounded an awful lot like personalized learning plans, which is really exciting to see that they are already moving on that, and maybe they already have intended to. So that's the only report I have, unless Marcus shares something.
No, I think that's it.
Ruth?
Just from research and standards, two things. One, the proposal to set up an independent research entity has moved out of the education committee. It's now in the committee of the whole. A lot of the major points that a lot of people here were very interested in about having the ability to do some independent research and get independent data still stands. The big difference is that the advisory board was changed. The steering committee board, which was meant to be a big stakeholder group, has been changed to have a majority of mayoral appointees on it. But I know a lot of the people on both the committee and on the council, that's not what they intended. So I do expect and hope that will be addressed in the committee of the whole. The other thing I just wanted to raise under the standards question is, and others may want to comment on this or not, but we've been hearing this, I've been hearing about a number of schools where the social studies and science standards, or the social studies and science instruction is being cut back as a way of providing more time for reading and math. And I just think that is something that we need to maybe take a look at. Maybe that's the kind of thing we want to do a report on next year, is to try to understand the extent to which the standards, which are approved and are supposed to be instructed, are in fact being taught. And I believe the Power Ed as well has a.
So if I can chime in on this, over the summer, Ruth, Marcus, myself, other board members were informed that several middle schools in DCPS did not have schedules that allowed for students to get a full course of science and social studies. In August, we were informed, or I was informed, that that was not the case and fixes would be in place. They were, apparently, until last Monday when my daughter came home with a new schedule that eliminated a class section. And the result of that was a reshuffling of the schedule, and 7th and 8th graders at her school are only getting 70% of the time, and thus just over 70% of the curriculum in science and social studies. I've repeatedly, over the last 2 weeks, asked DCPS for middle school schedules from across the city, bell schedules and sample student schedules, so we can understand how many students this is impacting. At Elliott High, where my daughter attends, they are putting in some sort of fixes, but it's been unclear exactly what those are. Everything was on the table from teachers in ELA teaching some of the civics, social studies lessons, math teachers doing some of the science lessons, bringing in outside lessons, taking a day every other week or something to do some of these lessons. I'm not sure that is equitable, and the students are going to receive the education that they deserve, and we know that this impacts their performance on tests and their preparedness for high school. I'd like to request that the board ask DCPS for schedules across all middle schools. Formally put in that request either from the board or we work with the council to do that, so that we can truly understand, are our students meeting the standards that we have put in place for them to learn.
Thank you.
Can we do that? Is that?
Can we can ask them?
We can ask the response.
That's it. Okay,
But
so
I feel like you're conflating meeting standards or following standards with schedule. They are not the same thing.
That is true, but I think in talking with staff at the schools and staff at DCPS, what we're learning is, one, DCPS has a policy that students will receive X number of minutes of instruction in all 4 courses. They're failing to meet their own policy. That policy was put into place so that students would have access to the full curriculum because they mapped out the curriculum. So I think the first step is understanding what students are getting in different schools, and that's the request that I'd like to make, so that we can then talk to DCPS and have a true conversation. At school A, they're getting this many minutes, what does that look like? But at school B, they're getting that minus 30%. So how are you doing in filling in the full curriculum in that difference? I think it's a fact-finding at this point, as much as anything else. I've been incredibly frustrated by the lack of transparency and the fact that I've been told that student schedules can't be made available.
I did have one question, and I don't want to get too bogged down in it. With regard to the council action on a research consortium, wasn't part of the theory of action behind this initiative that the mayor controlled all of the data? And now the council's put forth a proposal that spends more money but retains mayoral control of the data? No.
Well, I mean,
The research
the main.
consortium, if it's a majority, what I heard was a majority of mayoral appointees would control that.
Right, that was not the original proposal.
Okay. But that's our proposal that has come forward.
Right.
So we'd still be in the same boat, but we'd be just spending more money.
I mean, I guess it depends on what they would do with it, but I certainly don't regard it as a satisfactory next step.
Okay. I'd love to talk to you offline about that.
Can I raise one other, I'm not sure if it's exactly, standards and research, but, so on the credit recovery issue, I understand that we pushed back on the proposal on credit recovery, and I gather that OSSE has said they're not gonna bring us anything else until next year. Meanwhile, I'm getting some sense that part of what's being put into place as credit recovery may be not observing the Carnegie requirements, which under current grad requirements, I think you have to observe the Carnegie requirements unless you go through the CBE proposal, the CBE waiver. So I think we really somehow need to find out what's going on, or maybe get a presentation about how this is being played out. Because I do think we were all very clear that there are some real problems with the credit recovery system. And the fact that, a proposal wasn't put forward that dealt with it, that doesn't eliminate the problem, that we need to have some understanding of what's going on with credit recovery.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I've certainly asked OSSE a number of times about the credit recovery piece, and I think and I don't mean to speak for them, but I think from their point of view, because there are no regulations that specifically talk to what credit recovery
Set with the performers.
they don't have the authority to talk to the LEAs about providing that information unless they do it on their own. And so maybe one of the ways to do that would be for us to approach some of the LEAs and ask them to make sure that their policies are following the current regulations, but I'm not sure it would cover all of the. I don't know that the LEAs would comply, but I also am not fully sure that they would cover all of our students. It may cover just high schools, because the graduation requirement is only high school. So maybe we can start there and ask for.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think credit recovery is primarily high school. So
It is.
Yeah, to deal with high school, and I think the way to talk about it is, the extent to which it meets the other existing standards around high school graduation requirements.
Sure, and so I mean, we have the policy from PCSD and the draft from. I don't think we ever got a draft from TCPS, but we have the final one now. I think has been issued. I think we have both of those, and I can circulate those again.
That'd be great. That'd be great to start with.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
We were very clear on our expectations. I think we were very clear with OSSE and LEAs that they have systems in place and policies in place. And the whole problem with credit recovery at DCPS was that they weren't following their own policy. So if OSSE doesn't want to bring us a proposal now that reflects our concerns, then what we can do is just make sure that LEAs are following the policies of PCSD and the PCPS applies.
So I have one other note on this. I've been in several high schools and middle schools over the last couple of weeks, talking with building reps, staff on the ground, and it came up at my daughter's back to school night. Teachers are being instructed within DCPS to mark students present or tardy, so they get credit for being present for at least part of the course if they are in the class during any portion of the class. In other words, if a student walks in 2 minutes before the bell rings, they are instructed to mark that student present or tardy, but they get credit for being present. So I do think we need to ensure that the spirit of the rules are also being followed, and we're not continuing to push students through into credit recovery if they haven't met our seat requirements because of record-keeping issues. Of course, my conversations have been none of this is in writing, it is an oral policy coming from central office. So I can't verify it, I'm not accusing DCPS of anything here, but I do think we need to continue to keep our feet on the ground and understand what's going on in our high schools and middle schools.
I've met the Deputy for Education and he has reached out, so that's the issue that we'll get together sometime next week. Thank you. Anything else? Yes, Supervisor.
Set with the performers.
Already, right?
So we met on showed them our final presentation from the end of last year, just to give them an idea of what the SAC is about, and talk about how we will present our report this year.